Hi there. We are delighted to be involved in this week's edition of Job Shadowing HE. I'm Vivi. I'm the founder of Black Bullion, and we are the home of student money. Black Bullion helps universities and colleges to help their students to learn everything that they need to know about money and develop their financial confidence and skills. We work with corporates and we work with universities to provide additional funding for students through our scholarship hub, and our brand new app will help students to manage their money as best as they possibly can. We're delighted to be involved and look forward to your thoughts. Bye.
I'm Susanna Marsden, and welcome to Job Shadowing HE, the podcast that delves into the roles of people working in higher education. Each episode hears from guests about what's involved in their role, the career path that led to it, and tips on how to get in and get on in these jobs. My guest in this episode is Yemi Gbajobi, Chief Executive of the Students' Union at the University of Arts London. Yemi has been described as a champion of the student movement and has worked within students' unions for the past 15 years. In this episode, Yemi shares more about her career path, the dimensions and complexities of her role, her experiences of the intersectionality of being a young Black female leader in higher education, and how and why students' unions need to think about students of the future. So welcome, Yemi. Thanks so much for being my guest today. Let's start with an overview. You're Chief Executive Officer of Arts Students' Union at the University of Arts London, which is made up of several world-renowned colleges totalling just over 20,000 students. Tell us a bit more about this unique university, the Students' Union, and your role.
The University of the Arts London is definitely a unique institution. Student numbers now are around about 22,500 students. And it is, according to the QS World Rankings, the second best art school in the world. But what's really interesting about arts as an institution is its student profile and what that means for the staff that work there, in the Students' Union in particular. So at current, 52% of our students are international students, 70% are women, and the institution with its colleges are spread across the breadth of London. London College of Fashion just opened a new building in Stratford, all the way down to Shepherd's Bush, and then out to Twickenham, as well as Camberwell, Peckham and Chelsea. And so what that means for the union is that the students that it serves are really atypical, I think, from the rest of the higher education sector. And I know lots of institutions will say that our students are different. We serve really unique populations. But I think when you take all of those things into account, we have to think slightly differently about the way in which we do everything to really make sure that we're catering for our students. And for Arts SU, what's really important, and the reason why we exist, is because we believe in the power of students to create transformational change and experiences. And so that's what we seek to do. And we try and do that through a multitude of ways. So that could be through developing students' ability to advocate change. And that could be things like student voice structures, course rep structures, campaigns on decolonizing the curriculum. It could be around transforming their community and experience. And we've got sports clubs and societies. And alongside that, we run events and exhibitions for students. Or it could be just, and I say just, but it's not just, getting students to change their own lives. And our advice team is a huge part of that, which sometimes for those students, helping them to stay in uni and graduate is a core way in which they're able to change their own lives. And so that's a little bit about how the union operates and why we seek to exist. And my role, the best way I can describe it is a chief civil servant role. So I am the most senior staff member at Arts Students Union. I've worked there for almost 8 years. And we have the elected officers who are the front face and the political leadership of the organisation. My role is to focus on organisational strategy and stewardship and really ensure that students at Arts have a long-term Students Union into the future. And in the organisation, we have about 40 career members of staff. We have 30 student staff and a turnover of just over £3.5 million.
And in reading up on you, I've seen you described as a champion of the student movement. Take us through your career journey so far. And I'm particularly interested to know more about what's motivated you into and through the profession, and also what continues to drive you now.
So I'm going to answer the questions the other way round. I'll start with the what drives me, and then hopefully that will answer the question of my career journey. So I really believe in the student union's ability to change lives. And often it sounds really grandiose because it's like, we're student unions, and the past history of students unions is to get people drunk and have a good time and maybe play some sport. But I really believe in the ability of the organisations to change lives. And my example with that, and whenever I speak to new staff who start working in the union and maybe are coming from outside the sector, is there's a fabulous TED talk from Drew Dudley. It's 2010 TED talk, and it's called Lollipop Moments. And he talks about how he worked in a students' union in Canada, and first day of term, at welcome fairs, freshers fair, whatever you want to call it, he was walking around and giving out lollipops to students. And when he was doing that, he had introduced one student to another. And then he talked about 4 years later at graduation, he then saw that student again. And that student had talked about how that first day they had been with their parents, and they had really been doubting whether they should be there or not. And that introduction that Drew made from one student to another actually led to that student finding their life partner and getting married. And they thanked them for changing the trajectory of their life. And what's really striking about that TED talk is not the changing of the lives that happened, but the fact that the speaker doesn't remember that interaction. For him, it wasn't every day. And it just reminds me that the work that we do in student unions, and what drives me at this point, is knowing that in my everyday life, I can change the trajectory of somebody else's life. And that can mean that we have allowed someone to be introduced to a new friendship, a new relationship. They could find a new passion. They could change their career choice. They could find a hobby that they had never been exposed to anywhere else. And the Students' Union allows them to do that. And the work that I do by making sure that the organisation is still standing is allowing them to develop skills and confidence that can't be found in a classroom. And I don't want to critique what happens in the academic environment. I think that's important, but I also think it's important to recognise that there are people like me who are driven to support students outside of the classroom, and that's what keeps me going on a regular basis. And so a little bit about my career. I was introduced to the Students' Union by my housemate, who wanted to join the women's rugby team. She didn't want to go by herself. And so she was like, "Oh, buy you drinks tonight if you come with me." And I was like, "Sure, why not?" And that for me was the genesis of a life-changing decision, because I was then introduced to a sport that I had never played. I'm from Southeast London, born and bred. We didn't do rugby. We just about did football. And like, I was introduced to people I'd never met before. I became an activities officer for 2 years, working at the Union of Brunel Students. And then I went to law school, as I'd always intended, at the College of Law, but that was around 2008, during the beginning of the recession. And legal jobs were hard to come by, particularly as I was doing it part-time, because I needed to pay for law school because it was very expensive, still is. And as I was kind of moving through law school, I decided that it wasn't right for me. It gave me great skills, but it just wasn't an environment I felt I would be my best, and it didn't fill me with the passion I thought it would. But I had found a job working in a students' union, and that filled me with joy. So I carried on doing that. I joined London South Bank Students' Union in 2008 as a coordinator and kind of worked my way up to senior manager. And I really enjoyed working with the people I work with there. I still am great friends with them now. But when I left, I kind of wanted to test myself as to where I was in my career. I just come back from a period of maternity leave and was kind of having conversations about where I wanted to go and what I thought my career would be. And so there was an opportunity for a CEO role in a small students' union, or what was at the time, it's not anymore, came up. And I thought, well, what's the worst that could happen? I love working with students. I love doing what I'm doing. And I have a vision about what I thought students' unions should be. So I went in and applied, and I didn't think I would get it, but I did. And so I went to City University London Students' Union, and I loved that because it taught me an amazing amount about being an authentic leader, and not having to shrink myself, and actually recognizing that I can show up as myself, and still lead an organization. And then I guess not finally, but the current step on my career journey was opportunity to be at a larger organization came around. And once again, I was like, oh, what's the worst that could happen? And the outgoing CEO thought I should be taking that step, even though I didn't feel ready. But here I am today.
So let's delve a bit more into the dimensions and complexities of your role. In many other settings, a CEO would be the face of the organisation, but in the Students' Union, that public face, as you've said already, is the elected student president and other elected officers. So I'm wondering if that setting presents a particular type of leadership challenge or requires a particular type of leader to be comfortable. What's your approach, and how do you respond to that setting?
I'm not sure if it requires a particular kind of leader, because I think that would put people in boxes. And the great thing about working in student unions is the ability to exercise different types of leadership. And throughout the movement, there are different types of leaders depending on the union you're in and the type of students you're operating towards. But I do think it presents a challenge that leaders of students' unions need to be prepared for and navigate. And so there are aspects of our leadership styles that we have in common. And one of the things I think is incredibly important in terms of the leadership is due to the often young nature or definitely inexperienced nature of the student officers you have to have, and as a leadership quality, have a really strong coaching and mentoring role with them. And so what that means is you often just can't stand back. I think as civil servants, or the perception of civil servants we sometimes have, is civil servants step back and allow democratic leaders to take all of the accountability. In this sense, you can't do that. You can't allow them to take all of the criticism and heat that comes from being an elected officer, because you're also having to coach and mentor them through a role that sometimes they don't understand. And so in terms of that complexity is having to shoulder responsibility for decisions that you didn't take, and sometimes you didn't agree with. And there's often lots of different opportunities. If you speak to student union chief execs up and down the country, they will tell you, probably in private, not in public, about decisions that officers could have taken which you didn't necessarily agree with, but you have to help them move through that and be able to enact that. And that takes a particular leadership quality of I would say collectivism, even as a leader, and a humility, which can be a delicate balance to have to navigate. And so for me, I think when I'm thinking about the complexities, I often just have to check back in with myself and ask myself a number of questions, like, I have to ask myself, is this something with which I can support the decisions, support the officers with my experience? Or is there something that you just have to stand back and allow them to take their own path, even if you've seen it before? And sometimes you do see disasters coming, and you know they're coming because you've been around for a while, but the officers want to be able to try. And the great thing about students' unions is it's a learning space. And so you create the safety net for them to fall, but sometimes you have to allow them to fall. And that's as much a part of leadership as allowing people to experience that failure and still rise from it. And you being prepared to support them through that, as much as making sure they succeed all the time. And so I think for me, that's the biggest complexity is your leadership is visible. It's just not always visible by what you do.
A students' union is most commonly legally independent from the university, and it needs to have that independence for it to work effectively. But at the same time, there are two other factors in play. I mean, a union gets a substantial financial grant from university to help it operate. And also from a student point of view, I mean, the relationship needs to work well to best support the students. But I'm guessing there may be some pushes and pulls in that setting between the union and a university. Can you tell us a bit more about that, how that pans out in practice?
It's a constant seesaw, but I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. I think there are lots of spaces and places, even in amongst higher education institutions themselves as entities, where you may well see some seesaw or balancing in terms of we want to be able to do something, but we have to recognize who like the bigger picture. I think it's really important to find that correct balance at the right time. And I often think colleagues who are not at a senior level in a students' union thinks that there is a more adversarial relationship between unions and universities, and there actually are. And I think because students' unions are legally independent, often, and more times than not, from the university, I think sometimes colleagues think we do that in order to create this adversarial nature with the institution, when really it just gives us a flexibility to be more responsive and proactive. The way I would constitute the relationship and how that push and pull works is it's a critical friend relationship. Those who've been in student union sector for a while would have had this a lot of time, but it's a critical friend. And what that means in practice is between unions and universities, yes, we're independent, but 80% of the things that we work on, we agree on, and we work on them together, and we're in lockstep and we're doing that work together, and students are on boards in the institution and the institution's talking to the union and all of those things. And it's great. And then there's probably 10% where we agree the same destination, but a bit like Google Maps, we'll take different paths, and we'll agree to disagree about who gets there first. And who did it better, and so on and so things. But we try and keep our eye on the prize, that the destination is the same, even if we're taking different paths. And then the bit that gets the most noise is the remaining 10%, which is we will have a difference of opinions on things. Students will have a different opinion, and students' unions will have a different opinion to universities about how things work. And so I think oftentimes when we're thinking about the independence and the effectiveness and the grant and all of those things, like we focus on that 10%, and we're trying to be risk averse of that 10% instead of recognizing that 90% of the work that we do is for the best interest of students. For me, and the way in which I work with student unions and universities I worked with in the past is remembering that it's a balancing act, although we are financially dependent on the university, the students' union is built on its values. And so it's really important to establish within the union and within the people who work in it and with the officers and the trustee boards about what are our red lines. What are the values that we won't compromise? What are some of the important conversations within the sector at the moment that the union needs to have an opinion on and an understanding about what those things are. The bit that colleagues who work within the higher education won't see is the conversations that happen behind closed doors. I think they often think that officers just come up with ideas based on youth and exuberism and this kind of rose-tinted view of what the world should be. And actually what they don't see are some really diligent and deliberate young people who take time to work through all of the lenses that they could do before they come up with these value sets. They think about the perspective of the institution. They don't always agree with it, but they do look at it from the perspective of the institution. They look at it from students. They do understand the implication of some of these things, what it could mean for funding and all of those things. And so there are lots of conversations about where those red lines are, what those values are. But it's really important we have those, because I can't be in all of those spaces. Colleagues can't be all of those spaces, but we have to be able to trust that we're all sharing the same message. And so if anyone is thinking about like, how do we navigate the push and pull in those settings, it's just being really clear about this is what we stand for. These are our red lines when it comes to some of the things we're working with. Everything else is open for kind of collaboration and discussion. And that's 90% of the work that we do. But knowing that we do have some differences of opinion, which are fundamental to how our student union operates.
The nature and scale of your job means that no day or week is going to be typical. But bringing together some of the things that you've talked about so far, can you give us a bit more insight into the type of activities that you're doing? I mean, say at a midpoint in the academic year.
Of course. I sometimes think university colleagues think that the work that happens in unions means we fly by the seat of our pants. And to a point that they're right. I mean, we are a more reactive organisation to students than colleagues in the university. We're able to be more agile with less bureaucracy. And what that means, I guess lots of people say it, no day is ever the same. Being CEO of a students' union, no day, week or month is probably ever exactly the same. And if I give you just an example of like the last couple of weeks, I've gone from kind of writing financial papers for our trustee board, negotiating contracts for an external venue we're going to use for an awards night, been working on our code of practice for the new freedom of speech legislation, while also thinking about the gross profit ratios for the sales in our bar, and updating the health and safety compliance for our organisation, and a whole bunch of other confidential stuff that I can't even mention on this podcast. And that's just in the last couple of weeks, the array of different activities that I've been able to do. I think something I would say to colleagues who might not know what students' unions do at this point in the year is that we are very similarly tied to the timelines of the university. If I go back to the previous question, which is like the financial relationship between unions and universities, I'm working on budgets the same way you guys are working on budgets. I'm thinking about inflation. I'm thinking about potential cuts in budget. I'm thinking about strategy the same way that other colleagues are. And so I guess I would end this bit just by saying that although we are able to be flexible and we look like we're having great fun in the Students' Union, which we are, it doesn't mean that we're undisciplined. It doesn't mean that we don't have plans and processes and business planning like others. It's just we probably have far more fun doing it sometimes than colleagues in universities will.
You're a highly successful, younger, Black female leader in higher education. And in research I've read about you, you've talked about that complex intersectionality that you have as a younger Black woman that's challenging and tiring to navigate. What approach do you take in response to that challenge and fatigue? And as a role model, what advice do you give to others?
So I won't lie, it can be exhausting. interestingly, I had a session with an organisation who are helping the union do some work on its approach to social justice. And we were talking about identities and how we wear them. And I recognize that my womanhood and my blackness, I can't hide those. I don't have an option to disclose them to people as and when I feel comfortable. There are assumptions and impressions made about me before I am able to open my mouth and show how articulate and driven I am. And I have a number of examples of where that has happened. Unfortunately, in a higher education sector, and the bit we have to recognize, although universities are driving towards trying to be more equitable places and more diverse places, particularly in senior management positions, they still tend to be quite white male and older spaces, which can sometimes make conversations I have in those spaces challenging for the assumptions that are made about me. I've had judgments and questions about, well, you must be an officer. And I'm like, actually, no, I'm a staff member with 15 years experience and really great skin, but thank you. I've also had it where I've had male colleagues deferred to in a meeting or assumed that they were the chief exec instead of myself. And those have been awkward spaces. The way I tend to deal with it is humor, because I think sometimes that's a response that isn't expected. I think oftentimes the expectation of an angry Black woman is still something which sits just under the surface of something. So I use humor to deflect things. But I continue to stay in those spaces for two very clear reasons. Firstly, and I say it with all of the ego that is intended, I deserve to be here. I've worked incredibly hard and I am intelligent and I am qualified. So why should I not be here? Why should I not take up the space? And why should I not make the contributions that I am making? They are justified. But secondly, also, I'm the mum of two girls, 5 and 10, also known as 15 and 25. And I want them to be able to go into a room in the future when they move into the world of work, whatever they choose to do, and not have some of the feelings that I have felt when I have been in those spaces. And I realize that in order for them to feel empowered to do that, not only is it about giving them confidence, but also giving them an example about how we show up in those spaces, and then also doing some of the hard graft of kind of changing views and perceptions so that when they walk into those spaces in 10, 15 years time, like that's not even something they have to consider or think about. For advice for others, I think my first piece of advice is the recognition that it can be tiring, and it's okay for you to, when people ask you the question, how are you doing, to say, no, I'm not fine. And that's okay. But also I would say advice in terms of finding your tribe, and those are the people who you can be vulnerable with, who can support you, who will pick up the heavy lifting of gender and race-based conversations and kind of the things that go along with those conversations with you. And one primary example for me is someone who I worked with, who now is a very, very great friend during the Black Lives Matter protests, which also happened during COVID. We were having conversations in our union about race and our response to Black Lives Matter and what the union was going to do. And I had to be honest and say, I don't have the capacity right now to be a leader on race in my organization when I am feeling this personally. And that's all I needed to say. And she picked up those conversations and she led on that work and carried it on. And I recognize at that space that I don't have to do this all by myself. I don't even have to do this with other Black people by myself. I do this with people who are willing to see me, who I am, who I know I can be vulnerable with, and ask for support and help. And they will do that without even any kind of questions that could go alongside that.
You're currently a council member of England Rugby, a trustee for the Association of College Unions International, which is based in the US, and an associate at Cool Insight. Hearing you today, I mean, I can obviously see why these organisations would snap you up. But alongside everything else you do, a really demanding day job, as you've talked about, family life. I know you've also done some recent educational qualifications. I'm wondering what motivates you to get involved with other organisations.
For me, I really want to be the best leader and professional, running the best organization, doing the most innovative and impactful work. And so in my career, I recognize for me, that requires some space to be uncomfortable. It's where I can do my best thinking. But also, I recognize that I know what I know. I can operate within the confines of my own knowledge, but working with other organizations exposes me to things that I don't know and gives me the opportunity to push myself and think about, okay, this organization is having these sets of conversations. How do I bring them back to my own context? And so I am a great proponent and supporter of people in my organization going out and working with other organizations if they have the capacity to do that, because you get so much learning in the spaces that you just don't expect them to be. And so I think that for me is the key as to why I get involved, because I'm just able to be in another headspace. I'm able to think about different ideas and different approaches and really get the best of what professionals as a whole bring. But it's really important that I don't do everything, and that's against my nature. I'm kind of the eldest of four. I'll do it. But I recognize now as I get older, it's important for me not to do everything. So I am deliberate about who I choose to work with. I can't take up every opportunity, but I do have to ask myself like some core questions in terms of getting involved in other organizations. One is around, can I add value to them as much as they'll add value to me? And I know when I speak to officers and I've spoken to some of my staff about joining organizations, I keep telling them, like, don't just join an organization because it looks good on your CV. Like, can you add value to them as much as they add value to you? That's the way you will get the most out of it. I also have to ask myself, like, will I be passionate about this on a day-to-day when it's cold and it's dark and it's 6 o'clock in the evening on a Wednesday? Are you still willing to kind of log on to that Zoom call and do that work and be involved in that organization? You have to be passionate about them on a day-to-day. And then a couple of other questions I ask, like, is do I have the time? And that's an honest, self-reflecting conversation. Just because I can doesn't mean I should, and vice versa. But also having that conversation with my family, work-life balance. I like to call it work-life prioritization rather than balance. And is recognizing, like, okay, I'm going to be focused on this organization for a couple of days or a couple of weeks. Is this something we can fit into our family life? Is this something that we can fit into our time? Do the kids understand, like, I might be distracted from one thing while I focus on another thing, but I will come back and we'll have our family time and spend those things. And so that's what motivates me is being able to be my best self, but also being able to do things which fill me with joy, but also make me the best parent and person I can be for my family. Also motivates me as well.
Going back to life as a Students' Union CEO, as you said earlier, you've been involved as a member of staff in the student movement for around 15, nearly 16 years. The world's changed dramatically during that time, as has student life. So adaptation is clearly key to ensuring that students thrive. In response to that, what would you say is the most important thing that Students' Union should be doing now and looking forward?
So I think there's a couple of things. I do think it depends on your context, but one of the primary things that Students' Union should be thinking about now is the students for the future as well as students now. And it's a challenging line to tread, primarily because the Charities Commission says you have to look at those in membership now, and so we do. but we have to create space, intentional space, to think about the students of the future and making sure we're setting up our organizations to really deliver for students of the future. And I don't know at the moment what the next 15 years worth of, like what students in 15 years are going to look like. I just know that the student population when I started 15 years ago is fundamentally different than the student population we're thinking and talking about now. And I often reflect back and think 15 years ago, we should have been having bigger conversations about mental health and how we made investments in our union. We should have been having greater conversations around technology and what that meant for the work that we were doing. We should have been having more conversations around cost of living, from the very base needs of kind of housing and transport and commuting that we weren't doing. And so kind of when COVID and inflation hit, we were all, unions and universities, behind the 8 ball, because we were delivering for the students now, which I understand, but hadn't thought about the students of the future. And so I think that's the thing that students' unions should be doing, is thinking about the students of the future. And so for me, really thinking about unions as collections of people and not just buildings is going to be important in that. I know from my institution, there's a real move over the next 5 years to move to more online, low residency courses, looking at more pre-degree courses, looking at a greater expansion of postgraduates. So all of those students who, if I'm honest, in the student union sector have been on the peripheries, are real focuses for institutions now. And we also have to think about, like, what does that mean for what we are delivering for them throughout their time and as those strategies move forward. A couple of other things I think we should be thinking about, something I like to call cultural competency. We've had massive growth in international student numbers, but I don't think our cultural competency and capacity in student unions has increased. And what I mean by that is we spend a lot of time trying to speak to international students about, this is how you exist and operate in the Western educational framework. And here's the things you need to know. We don't take enough time to get an understanding of, okay, we have a large number of students from East Asian countries or South American countries. What is the educational context? What is the students' union context from those countries? How do we understand that, so then we can have a better conversation with international students who are coming? And so because of that lack of cultural competency, we're often trying to pull people towards us and failing, rather than trying to meet them where they're at. And then lastly, I would say to student unions, and those who know me know I'm a huge proponent of this, but looking at more global partnerships than being insular. So I do work with ACUI, the Association of College Unions International, because there are lots of conversations that are happening globally, and we're not doing enough to join up the dots and have those conversations, get a real understanding about what's coming down the line, how we can adapt, how we can share information. If we'd done that, some of the things around mental health and basic needs of students, we'd be more prepared for, which we're not. And students' unions will often say, well, I'm here to deliver for the students on my course or at my institution. I'm like, yeah, you are, but they don't have two heads. They are similar students to the students down the road and the students across the world. And maybe like you should get out of your box and have a look at what's going on and take those ideas back for the benefit of your students, rather than just thinking that you have all the answers on your campus.
Drawing our conversation to a close today, Yemi, finally, I'm interested to know what advice you'd give to someone thinking about becoming a students' union CEO.
My first thing is, if you're thinking about it, do it. One of my mottos is like, what's the worst that can happen? For me, it is the best job. It has shaped my life and taught me so much. And I can safely say there isn't a job like it. As I mentioned earlier, in what other sector, in what other capacity will you write board papers and also go and watch a rugby game, and also go to an exhibition, and also have a conversation about decolonizing the curriculum, and also have a conversation about the freedom of speech, all potentially within 48 hours. And the way that you're able to have not just your professional life expanded, but your view on the world shaped by the people who you come in contact to is just an amazing experience. But what I would say also for someone who is thinking about being an SU chief exec is, if you are thinking about it in terms of the Students' Union when you went to university, that doesn't exist anymore. Student unions have adapted and they have moved on. And while I have incredible fun and I'm able to be creative and I'm able to do some amazing things, we are professionals. And so if you are wanting to become a student union chief exec, it's important to do your research, understand the different types of students' unions that exist. There are different types of higher education institutions who cater for different markets and different things. It's the same for students' unions. Each has its own value set. Each has its own type of students, and getting understanding about what you would be walking into is crucial, but also making sure you learn different parts of the business. What does it mean to support sabbatical officers? What does it mean to be involved in budgets? What does it mean to take part in HR and do HR in a staff team, which has lots of new professionals who are finding their ways in the world? And then lastly, I would say to anyone who's thinking about an SU chief exec, do you have a mentor? Do you have someone who you're talking to? I am the product of people who have poured into me, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly. But as I sit back and reflect, I can see how I'm a product of all of the people who've been able to touch different parts of my career and get me to where I was going. So making sure you have mentors, making sure you have more than one, making sure that mentors operate in different spheres and different sectors and have different demographics, and really just building that tribe that I was talking about to have the best collection of people around you, helping you to take that next step in your career.
Yemi, it's been great talking to you today. Thank you for sharing so much and for letting me shadow you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Job Shadowing HE. The podcast was written and presented by Susanna Marsden, audio production and music by me, Rodri Marsden. More information about this podcast and previous episodes can be found at jobshadowinghe.podbean.com.